Yes, we are live. All right, very good. Welcome to the fifth iteration of the class. The fourth, well, I guess the sixth iteration is the 400s, because we began before Christ was born. All right, major trends for this century. Now, I'm doing this by centuries. There's going to be some bleed over that because I'm not going by topic. I'm going by century. I'm going to go into the councils. We covered last time some what they call the fathers, these bishops who stood up and fought against the various heterodox opinions, the various sects and cults who were trying to infiltrate Christianity and make it something that it wasn't supposed to be. Those figures are very important, and their writings are much of what Anglicanism was based upon. When we get further, several centuries later into Anglicanism, they will look back at the fathers and say, what did they mean in these earliest centuries versus some of the accretions that happened later? They're very important. But they worked together, let's say, in councils. And councils became, the bishops coming together and making decisions really became this juggernaut of united thought and united belief in the church, which gave it its strength. The second thing is Western monasticism. I find this to be hysterical, and maybe you'll find it as funny as I am when we get there, how this movement of monasticism began in the East. And when it went to the West, the Western went like, we're not doing it like that, and reinvented the entire structure on a kind of a Western perspective and Western cultural norm. I find it very fascinating. And finally, the fall of the Roman Empire. As you see, I have it in quotes. That's a very weighted term on what exactly that meant. But something did happen toward the end of the 5th century, which signaled a real shift, and we'll go into that. So, as I said before, the idea of the bishops coming together and sitting down and arguing it out, and I actually forgot to put the slide of St. Nicholas punching Arius because it happened at Nicaea, which we'll go into in a second here. These were not peaceful things at all. So the bishops got together and they argued it out and they fought over what do we mean by the natures of Christ? What do we mean by his relationship with the Virgin Mary? What do we mean by? And as they went through these things, there was a terrific struggle that took place to hammer these things out against these varying opinions. And a number of people, and again, I'm not quoting them, we covered the fathers last time, so I'm not going to go into, because believe me, there's enough to cover in just what they were about. Of these various personalities who showed up and argued very, very eloquently regarding these doctrines. One of the church's main duties was the protection of the deposit of faith. The teachings of Jesus and the revelation of the Old and New Testaments, the Christian church saw as one of her chief responsibilities. So meetings were called whenever a heterodox opinion threatened general orthodoxy. And there were 7 great ecumenical councils. Ecumenism, and I probably should have put that on there, I realized this morning I hadn't, is the Greek word oikos, which means house. And oikumenos is housekeeping or house cleaning. And ecumenical comes from the same idea, oikos, so this idea of we're one house, we're one church, we should believe all the same way. It comes to being generally accepted, ecumenical. On the authority of the councils, which again, this is a perspective which is Anglican in the sense of the church speaks, not necessarily one person in the Pope, although the Pope certainly was important. We know from Acts 15 that the calling of a council to determine controversial matters was established by the apostles themselves. The Council of Jerusalem, 1848 and 49, chaired by St. James, brother of Christ, the problem of keeping Jewish law was discussed and was established the circumcision, and the dietary laws were not required of Christians. Writing to the Patriarch of Constantinople in the 6th century, St. Gregory refers to the significance of councils and the defining of doctrine, which he equates with Scripture. We believe the decisions made by the bishops at ecumenical councils were made under divine inspiration. They stand at the center of tradition, along with the divine Scripture and the writing of the fathers, to proclaim what the church believes. This idea of establishing when the church has decided to hold on became a very key and an essential part of being able to define what Christianity meant in this sea of not only external influences, but even some internal questions. The first council that most known is the Council of Nicaea. It condemned the teachings of Arius, who taught that the Father, the Son, and the Spirit were created and inferior to the Father. While Arius argued that Jesus Christ was created out of nothing or out of something, the council affirmed that he was begotten of the substance, the essence of the Father. And there's a famous thing here for the question of the O. Arius used the term homoousios, like unto the substance of the Father. The council instead adopted the term homoousios, of the same substance. A lot of people look at this and go, oh my gosh, that's too complicated. We use this today. We say opioids, like unto opiates, or cannabinoids, like unto cannabis. The idea that oi being similar to but not exact is actually quite ancient. From the council, we have the words of the Nicene Creed, which state, I believe in one, O Lord Jesus Christ, only begotten Son, begotten of the Father, light from light, true God from true God, begotten, not made, one essence with the Father. This was the first attempt to try and explain that Jesus was God truly, of the same substance and essence with the Father, not a created being, not someone special, but truly and completely God. It also looked at the things, the date for the celebration of Pascha or Easter. The Melitian schism, a branch of Donatism we've covered before, admitting lapsed Christians back into communion. Various matters of discipline, which resulted in 20 canons. Canons are official rules laid out for the church. Organization structure of the church, focused on the ordering of episcopacy or bishops, dignity standards for the clergy, issues of ordination at all levels, and of suitability of behavior and background for clergy. A lot of people, when coming into clergy, came from questionable or heretical backgrounds, and they said, okay, how much training do you need in the true faith before we let you in, considering the problems we're having as far as also just moral things and everything else. Reconciliation of the lapsed, establishing norms for public repentance and penance, readmission to the church of heretics and schismatics, including issues of when reordination and or rebaptism will be required. This will come up later on. I will actually cover this later on, several centuries from now, with St. Augustine and the question of baptism. It's a fascinating piece where the question of can heretics baptize validly? And of course they thought, well, no, if you don't believe correctly. And there was a huge fight. St. Augustine was involved. And he said, wait a minute, there's only one baptism. If you use the words correctly, you don't even need to believe properly. If you use the words correctly, it's a baptism, and that to prevail. It was quite a shock because initially they had thought that if you don't believe correctly, how can the sacraments be valid? And they said that actually the formula itself had a substance outside necessarily of correct belief. Liturgical practice, including the place of deacons, practice of standing or kneeling at prayer during, as you can see, they got down to some really nitty-gritties as far as organizing the church at this point in time. The First Council of Constantinople, this is kind of fascinating, confirmed and completed the Nicene Creed and addressed the heresy of Apollinarianism, which is an extension of Arianism. Heresy of Apollinarianism, according to which Christ had a human body and soul, but no human rational mind. The divine Logos taking the place of this. So he had body and soul, but his mind was totally in God. He did not have a separate human mind. The Council of Nicaea 25 produced, in order to end the controversy, signally failed to do so. Indeed, ultimately confounded the confusion because of its use of the words ousia and hypostasis were considered so ambiguous as to suggest the fathers of Nicaea had fallen into Sabellianism, a recognized view of heresy of that period. You can see how many heresies there are at this point. I'm not even going to collect all of them because there are just that many. What's interesting here is that the Arianism would crop up at any number of different places, and the level of minutia and nitpicking of these terms was tremendous. The idea of trying to talk your way around or talk your way out of or question exactly what this meant. Homoousi, similar like unto, or how, because he's different from the Father, so he's not exactly like, because he's not the Father. Doesn't that mean he's like unto? And again, the level of casuistry and argumentation and wordplay at this period and during this question of Arianism was tremendous. First Council continued, reinforced the decisions of Nicaea and condemned Arianism. Again, formally they said it was wrong. They officially said, if you are an Arian, you are henceforth deprived. Don't think that was the end of it. Arianism was rampant at this point in the Eastern Empire. The emperor was Arian. Much of the clergy were at least Arian-leaning, and the patriarch was Arian, or at least suspected to be Arian. Athanasius completed a more formal and articulate creed, which adopted, it was not immediately accepted. The Nicene Creed reached its current form at this council. The words concerning belief in the Holy Spirit were added at this point. Also, it was declared the Bishop of Constantinople should have a primacy of honor after the Bishop of Rome, because Constantinople was the new Rome. The fight that was going on at this point between, again, Constantinople, now you moved up because of the importance of this church, and the emperor and the patriarch was there continuing to fight this question out. I got to mention, I mentioned it really back in Nicaea, I told you, was when St. Nicholas finally walked up and sucker punched Arius, because he was just being such he wasn't being seriously pious, he was playing with words. This is where, again, they try and condemn and try and get rid of Arianism, but Arianism is rampant at this point. The Council of Ephesus, 431, condemnation of Nestorianism. Nestorius' doctrine, called Nestorianism, which emphasized the distinction between Christ's human and divine natures, and argued that Mary should be called Christotokos, the Christ-bearer, but not Theotokos, the God-bearer. It brought him into conflict with other church leaders, most notably Cyril, the Patriarch of Alexandria. Nestorian was basically opposite of Arianism. It's more subtle than that. The Christ was only divine and had no human nature. But it is not that simple, because you can see earlier it says Christ bearer but not Theotokos. He was only divine. How does that work? The idea being is that Arius stated that he was a man very close to that, whereas Nestorius was much more of a being who had been chosen of some sort, this divine creation of something like that. The level of subtlety of a lot of these heresies is actually very complex, and you read and you're like, what do you believe? This is the Greek world. It was the heritage of the philosophers of Plato and Socrates. They loved playing with language. They loved asking questions which would tie things in knots, and the church really had to fight its way out of this attitude. The Third Council of Ephesus, 431. The Second Council was rejected by the council. This is the Third Council. We jumped to the second one. It was rejected in the Council of Chalcedon. They addressed the teachings of Nestorius. He rejected the term Theotokos because he opposed the doctrine that taught that Christ was a single person, at once God and man. This teaching was anathematized. Also at this council, the title for the Virgin Mary is Theotokos, bearing of God, is confirmed by the whole church. This was a huge, the people were actually waiting outside because they'd been dedicated to this idea of Theotokos, that Mary was the Ark of the New Covenant, that carried God in her womb. And the Nestorians were saying, no, she wasn't. She carried the Christ, which is not the same thing as carrying God. And they were waiting outside for them to tell them. And the bishop came out and they said, Theotokos, you can use the term. And then the streets lit up with, yay, we can actually use that term. And they were able to confirm that she was indeed the mother of God and was the Ark of the New Covenant. So it was people were quite attached to this when this was happening. The Council of Chalcedon. Then in Chalcedon, modern-day Turkey, dealt with Nestorian and reasserted homoousios. But the problem did not end there. It was significant, setting the church's position and leading to the beginning of the end. So again, church is teaching this continually and condemning it, but Arianism really is a stain you just couldn't get out of the church at that point in time. Fourth Council of Chalcedon addressed teachings of Eutyches, a form of monophysitism. Monophysitism is a doctrine that Christ had a single divine nature, as against the Orthodox teaching of dual natures, human and divine. So again, they wanted to parse Christ down to make it simpler. He was only divine as opposed to being human and divine. The teachings of the previous councils were confirmed. Teachings of Nestorius and Eutyches and other monophysites were condemned. The Fifth Council of Constantinople, you see how long this goes on for and how much. We're going into the 500s now. Again, I'm not going to cover councils again. 400s is really where the majority of them happen. You have a couple before and a couple after, but the 400s is really where this fight takes place. So to further condemn the Monophysite heresy, the doctrine of the Trinity was set out, also the two births, in eternity and in time, of the divine word and Jesus Christ, one person, God and man, at the same time. It was the one same person who wrought the miracles and suffered death. So the idea of his eternal generation from God in the beginning was the word, that he was generated by God eternally, but that did not affect the time. This is the thing, it says there was never a time when Jesus Christ was not. So you say he was born, he was generated of the Father. It's almost like an eternal, he's like constantly being generated in a sense. Not necessarily something we can understand as humans, but the idea was if he was generated of the Father, well, how about before he came around? They said, no, that's a human understanding. This is an eternal thing. It is not fully understandable. Plus, he was also born into time, but in time he was actually born, and he actually died. Eternally, it wasn't the same thing. He was eternally being engendered, and then again, the Holy Spirit was this kind of him loving his Father back. There never has been sufficient language to fully explain this because it's not fully explainable. It is a great mystery, but they wanted to articulate what it wasn't, even if they couldn't say for sure what it was. The Sixth Council of Constantinople, where much later at this point in time, there was the heresy of monotheism, saying that Christ did not have a human will. This council stated that in our Lord Jesus Christ there are two natural wills and two natural operations, invisibly, incontrovertibly, inseparably, without any fusion, as the Holy Fathers have taught, and that these two natural wills are not contrary. Again, you have Jesus, who knows what he has to do and obeys the Father, but you can also see the human will in him. Oh Lord, if this chalice can pass from me. He had two wills, two understandings. This was considered to be, a lot of people fought against this idea. Wouldn't that make him schizophrenic? Wouldn't he have different voices in his head? He said, no, the divine nature subsumed the human to a point, but the human nature of Christ was fully human all of his life long, had human understanding, had a human will, which rebelled against when even though he knew what he had to do, was still able to suffer and what have you as a human would. The Seventh Ecumenical Council, again, this is later on, but I'm not going to cover the councils again, to address the iconoclast heresy. This is actually a very important council. I probably will touch on it again sometime later, because this was a question of holy images and doesn't necessarily touch on doctrine the same way. But this was a huge issue, primarily in the East, about whether you can represent the Lord. Hostility to the veneration of icons had led to destruction and persecution, and this was the council which decreed their restoration. The following statement was made to express this. As the priceless, life-giving cross, so the venerable and holy images, they may be set up in their various forms in the churches, on the sacred vessels and vestments, on the walls, likewise in private houses and along waysides. The more often we look upon them, the more vividly our minds are turned to the memory of those whom they represent, to give them, the images, the adoration of honor, but not, however, true latria. Latria is the Greek word for the worship due only to God. So I could honor somebody and say, I worship you as the best runner or the best artist. That was not taken from God, who was worshipped alone as God, which is our faith teaches is to be given only to the divine nature, so that, like the Holy Cross, the Gospels, relics of the saints, to these image offerings of incense and lights may be made, as was the custom of our ancestors. The honor rendered to the images passes to that to which the image represents. Whosoever adores an image adores the person it depicts. For in this way is the teaching of the Holy Fathers strengthened, that is to say, the tradition of the Holy Catholic Church, receiving the gospel from one end of the world to the other. So the idea that you can say there's an image of so-and-so, and you could honor that image, honoring the person who it represents, and also distinguish it from latria. This is not worship in the sense of worship to God. It is veneration for the person, and prayers can be offered. There's some later councils that I won't go into, the Second Council of Constantinople and the Third Council of Constantinople, cleaning up various issues. You can see how long this goes on. The councils, again, were extremely important because the church came together and fought out and came to decisions regarding the key tenements of the faith and why, and tried to explain them as best they could. Arianism, just to finish up here, was such a hard heresy to get rid of, but not primarily because of its heresy. Arianism stated that Jesus Christ was ultimately just a man, the most divine of all men, but still not God himself. And Arianism was thus known for using contemporary music and other rubrics in their ceremonies. Arianism is kind of like the modern charismatic movement, or really more like modern Roman Catholicism. The idea of bringing in contemporary music and contemporary, the emotional appeal. Some of what you see today in the more emotional touch, or in this modern Roman, which is very sentimental, which doesn't pull toward the divine, was much of what Arianism was used. And the idea is that it was an emotional connection much more so than any kind of spiritual, or it really brought in the use of the senses, the use of music, even the use of dance was brought in with Arianism, because it was all about much more physical expression. God was a man and wanted you to express more humanly. So the Arianism, as much of a problem as it was as far as heresy, it was culturally far more significant than almost ever was doctrinally. Western monasticism, as I say, I find this to be hysterical. I showed you last time, and I write up about it in a second here, that when monasticism began, people fled the world, went out in the Greek, primarily Greek, went down into Egypt and lived lives of great austerity and closeness to God. And this grew, and there were whole cities, thousands and thousands of people who fled the Roman Empire as it was becoming more decadent, and went down and lived these lives of deprivation and spiritual closeness with God. And there were many great people that did that. But by the three and into the 400s, and it continues into 500, it will begin, this movement that got so big will come to the West. And the West looks at this and goes, we're not doing this. These are examples here of what the Western monasticism looked like as opposed to Eastern. Unlike the Eastern monks in Egypt and later in the Greek world, whose lives consisted of solitude, fasting, and memorizing prayers, those in the West who sought God had no desire to live solitary and frankly feral, uncivilized lives. Monks in the West organized in communities, united by common prayer, work, and study. There were three great founders of Western monasticism, and they're probably not who you think, i.e. it's not St. Benedict. He comes a good bit later. Communal prayer was emphasized. The psalms were sung in a choir. I wasn't able to find any good examples of this, of the back and forth way that they would sing the psalms and such. It was done in very tightly organized, very harmonious ways. Singing was coordinated, and you'd come in 8 times a day and sing the psalms and these various hymns, Gregorian chant. Again, this is the beginning of Western monasticism. I'll cover. It's going to grow from here and go on and become very popular. But Western monasticism had none of the flavor of Eastern at all. It was not solitary. It was not reciting prayers you'd memorized. It was not, never washing, living out in a cave, whatever. These were people who lived in community, who sang the psalms many times each day, come into the church and would sing in a very organized and structured way of singing, and would live lives where they would do their farming or eat their meals together and everything else. So it was a very different way of living. The photo here, I wanted to show the question of what the book looks like there. They don't usually put their forehead to the book. These are actually pictures of Carthusians, which is a monastery that comes many years later. I was actually in the Carthusians, and I actually did that when Jesus dies on Good Friday. You lean your head up against the book because you can't prostrate, you can't kneel down. But it gives you an idea of what the books actually do look like that. And they have it's like 1 for 3 or 1 for 2 or 1 for 3, and you'd sing out of them if you didn't have your own because they were big books. But this is how the choir and such kind of stuff were organized. You can see here, again, there's a choir, what the choir looks like, and they would all sit in the choir there. They have their books up. Also, they would come into the center and sing. They'd sing the liturgy. They'd sing the mass. And again, beautiful pieces, and it was very coordinated and harmonious. It was very much a group effort. It was not solitary. It was not all by yourself reciting or making baskets. It was in a community, organized, and rules began to be developed for these men. St. Augustine was actually the first person to put his mark on Western monasticism. He was a bishop, but he brought his clergy together and had them live in a community and began to pray and developed this idea. I think he was taught by St. Ambrose. We don't actually know. There are a couple also, but because of his influence and how well known he was, it was called the Augustinian Revolution, and he had a great deal of, the Bishop of Hippo in North Africa, organized his clergy into houses where they pray, ate, and studied together. His pattern became very popular and spread among houses for clergy all over the West. Many bishops copied his plan, and similar houses sprung up all over. They were called canons instead of monks. The Greek canon, meaning standard or measurement, literally a measuring stick, became a standard for clergy living in communities. He was more clergy living in community and they still ran parishes and schools, but people would see what he was doing, and were adopting it for use elsewhere. St. Martin of Tours. He actually, interesting, is not one of the fathers because he did nothing touching doctrine. He was a monk, and he was very well known in his age, for his influence on hospitality and praying, and people would come and learn from him, but he wrote nothing really concerning doctrine at all. You can see here him and his horse cutting his cloak in half to give to a beggar, and there's later on him dressed in his monastic robes, which probably isn't very close, but St. Martin was a soldier, although apparently unwillingly. How you end up as a soldier against your will still remains a thing. You think you'd volunteer for it? I don't think they had the draft. I don't know. Anyway, he's famous for having cut his mantle in half to give it to a beggar while still a soldier. There's a number of stories, and I didn't put them all up here because it'll take up too much time and isn't really my goal, of how he became a Christian, didn't want to be a soldier anymore. He was going to be forced to go fight. He ran out, stood there in front of the enemy naked because there's a number of interesting stories about him and his conversion. He later left the military and became a hermit. He was chosen as Bishop of Tours, but did not give his ascetical life or prayer as a bishop. He was very influential in the developing of the religious life. He founded Ligugé Abbey, and Ligugé is a very French word. I've never found really where the original Latin word was. Wikipedia insists it was Locachiacum, or small huts. I don't know that I believe that. I don't know what the original name was, but Ligugé, which is very French, is what I've always heard it called. Again, he was very influential on people living together in charity in the area, that kind of stuff, but really had no info. I don't think he even wrote anything down. John Cassian. John Cassian is possibly the most influential of those who made the leap from East to West. He was trained in the East and spent in fact, I think that's the same image I had for Martin of Tours. Oops. So he was trained in the East, and then brought the East to the West, and came in here, and he had what were called the Conferences of Cassian. His monks probably looked like more of those on the left than those you've seen previously. I don't actually know, but he was early enough that he really was kind of the transition from East to West. John Cassian was trained in the East in Skeet monasticism and brought it to the West. In the West, he helped to integrate it into Western culture and adapt it. His book, The Conferences of Cassian, is his most enduring legacy. Conferences of Cassian reads kind of like the Desert Fathers. Abbe, give me a word, and he would give pieces of wisdom and such. But he brought it over, he translated it into Latin so the Latins could read it, and then he brought along the much of the spirit. Again, it's interesting, and I couldn't find the book. I remember studying when I was in college. I did a whole thing on monasticism, and there's a book that I had that I can't find. It's actually probably in California, talking about when, and it may have been John Cassian, I don't recall. It was somebody coming into the East introducing monasticism, and right away there's books. Right away it isn't this kind of solitary aesthetical life. It's much more a matter of reading and learning and singing the Psalms. Community is a very different, and John Cassian is very adept at adapting monasticism to the West. Monasteries in the West were more organized, and learning and literacy played a big part. The monks in the West got together to pray the Psalms rather than doing it privately. Also, learning played a big part. It was considered normal that a monk would be taught to read and learn philosophy and theology. So again, the idea of being all by yourself and just praying your whole life was unheard of. They right away wanted to begin to learn writers. They wanted to learn philosophy. They wanted to learn theology. They studied the scriptures. Learning and education were very much a part of, and then obviously people would also come to them for learning. Study of Latin and literature, as well as philosophy and theology, was preserved by the monasteries. Men and women would get together, and you would have abbeys and abbesses. I don't know about abbey, that may be Benedict, because this is the very beginning of it now. And there is probably is especially well organized. Most of the people who write a little bit later on. This is still the beginning of it, but you can see right away, especially with Martin of Tours and with Augustine. John Cashin's mostly about his book. We don't really know what his monastery looked like as much. We do know what Ligugé looked like, and we do know what Augustine and the people that imitated Augustine was very much the idea, coming together in choir, singing, in harmonizing, beautiful singing of the Mass, the liturgy, and everything else was very much a part of this development. The fall of the Roman Empire. This is a weighted term that something did happen, as was her name, the thing, some people did something. Ilhan Omar, some people did something and the empire fell. No, this was, there was an event that could be likened to a fall, but it was not the fall of the Roman Empire. This is a prejudiced term for a complicated subject. The term was coined by Edward Gibbon in 1776 from his work, The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire. That in that book, he posits that Christianity basically was the whole problem, that Rome was a pagan ideal in the perfect world, and Christianity showed up, and everybody started loving their neighbor and not whatever, or something like that, and the whole world fell to hell, and if we could only get back to Rome, everything would be great. By Rome 400, Rome was no longer the capital of the empire. That honor belonged to Constantinople. Rome was a holy city, but no longer military or strategic. The military capital, the western half of the empire at this point, was Ravenna. So when the Goths, led by King Alaric, marched into Rome in 410 and declared it their territory, they struck a blow to the pride of the Roman Empire, but they really didn't take the capital. Still, it marked the point where the West was no longer the dominant side of the empire, and less attention was paid to it going forward. The last empire was deposed in 480. So when they came in there, they showed up and said, Rome is ours. Well, there was really nobody there to stop them. It was a holy city. It was not militarily strategic. It had more churches than it had fortifications at that point. It had a name, and the name of Rome, and people would come there. But at this point, honestly, St. Jerome talks about this. There were more people there to venerate the relics of the martyrs than there were any soldier at that point in time. But what really happened was a lot of noble families had their stuff stolen and got very upset about it. It still was a humiliation. Rome had been the center of the world, and her military and her nobility had been the envy of the entire world. And when the barbarians came in and they had to surrender their goods, it hurt. All of a sudden they realized that the world had changed, and that these people coming in could really threaten them. Again, the army could come in and take them, but Rome still, we almost like if Washington, D.C., someone marched in, it's ours now, and we're like, wow, actually we have a military, although we could probably take it back, but they still got in there. It was still kind of a shock that they went in there. Again, the whole idea of crossing the Rubicon and nobody stopped them, and they're like, what happened? And again, a lot of it was, we talked before, was that first the Celts and then the first wave of Germans came over, and then they were Romanized, so they would make pacts with them, and then they were supposed to stop the next wave of Romans. So the number of barbarians, so the number of Romans in the army had also significantly decreased. Again, the sack of Rome was really just a spoiling of many of the wealthy families, had their houses broken into, churches were pillaged, although not that much, obviously. Many of these, Alaric was more than likely a Christian. It was possibly his men. Again, you can't control soldiers necessarily, but it really wasn't a fall in any significant way. It was just that they came into the holy city and people thought that was never going to happen. So there was a humiliation and a shock of the fact that they'd made it that far. But the capital was in Constantinople. The emperor was there. Nothing really happened. The military is at Ravenna. It could still pretty much handle any problem. It was really just the visuals of it, if you will. What it was a loss of hegemony. The real fall of Rome was a loss of hegemony, meaning that being Roman was losing its prestige. As the German tribes filled the areas at once controlled by Rome, they did not teach their children Latin. They did not dress as Romans. They kept their own customs and culture. The Christian world is somewhat to blame for this because as the evangelists go out there, they tell them they don't have to become Roman. Initially, you had to with the first conversion of the empire. They would actually going to have you culturally much more assume Christianity was more Roman. As these people go out, it still does happen. Don't kid yourself. The idea of Latin being a sacred language and all, especially when the barbarians have customs that were unchristian. However, it didn't require you to give up your old culture and adopt a new one to be a Christian. Roman language and culture would survive in the church, which preserved the legacy of antiquity for another 1,000 years. It was the church that was going to preserve the antiquity and the writings of antiquity as these people came in. And again, they came in for sometimes good and sometimes bad reasons. Sometimes they were used by the emperor to defend its borders because they didn't have any more Roman soldiers. Sometimes, and I'll go into this next time, is the soldiers would come across and would be made Roman. And next thing you know, they thought they were Roman, walking around whatever they were wearing. And then they would run into real Roman soldiers and they would go like, you're a barbarian. Like, no, we're Roman. So what a Roman soldier wore even was going to change as the decades and into the centuries rolled along. And you're going to see that really happen in the 500s. But again, you had this loss of hegemony. All right, the 500s, which we'll go next. East versus West. You're going to see, and I'll show you, the cultures are going to slide apart, and the real flavors of the world of the Byzantine world and the world of the Latin West are really going to pick up their individual cultural idiosyncrasies. The monastic explosion, again, the church is going to hang on to much of the learning as these various tribes come in and begin tearing down what was once the Roman Empire. And so canons, cathedrals, and monasteries are really going to become the centers of learning and are going to become where really as the political infrastructure crumbles and as these various tribes are coming in, you have this, that's really where the fall of the Roman Empire was, is that you had kings coming in and you had kings fighting for each other, where you used to have one central imperial structure that took care of everything. You had local kings who were replacing what was a governor, but they did not necessarily have Rome to guide them, and they began fighting among each other and trying to save the empire. They were not ready to let it go. And Constantinople will say, okay, we're not ready for this to happen. We can fix this. And they will march out. It's absolutely fascinating how you have the emperor from Constantinople will march all the way around to Spain. And by the time he gets to Spain, if you walk in there, he begins making battle against his own troops because they're just so culturally different. He doesn't recognize them. They don't speak the same language. If they speak Latin, it's probably barbaric. He speaks Greek. And you literally have the empire almost tear itself apart, thinking it's trying to save itself because they don't recognize each other anymore. They've become so culturally different. And with that, are there any questions? Yes, sir.
Also, there's something you mentioned about this is from my staff going to say a lot on Christian welfare. I actually read something that said they said that King Ulrich and everything was a Christian, but he was an Arian as opposed to.
I'm sorry, who was?
King Ulrich.
Oh, he was an Arian? Quite possibly.
Yeah, they say that multiple German tribes were actually.
Well,
Arian.
what's interesting, and we'll get to this, again, that's a very good point to bring up, is that, I'll try to remember to cover this because that's a very good point. The Arianism was much more of an Eastern problem. And that's why you have all these councils in Ephesus and Constantinople and Chalcedon trying to fight this thing out with Arianism. But some of the Germans, they call them the Goths, Ostrogoths, Eastern and Visigoths, Western Goths. They came in from basically what is, I don't know, Georgia or Poland, or not Poland, Hungary, maybe somewhere in that area. And they come in, and the first Christians that they meet were the Arians. It was an Arian bishop who ran into these Goths and converted them to Christianity, and they ended up down in Spain. So they come into but they're Arians. So they end up making war on, there's a whole thing in Spain, over Visigothic Spain, which is Arian. And they'd all adopted Arianism. And it wasn't the Arianism of the East, which was all kind of hoopty-doopty. It was much more, they believed Arianism, basically. And you had, very possibly that Alaric, because the early Germans that came in were caught by whatever, this Arian bishop met them as they were coming into the empire, converted them. They went into these various parts of the empire as Arians. They didn't know the history of Arianism the same way that the other people did, though. It was much more a matter of we're Christians, and I'm not even sure they called themselves Arians. But I have read that before, and it's entirely possible that Alaric was, again, he probably was a Christian. Again, it wasn't, the fall of Rome wasn't sudden. It wasn't a matter of the barbarians came in, these were Christians. Again, Alaric, one of them, but I don't recall whether it was Odoacer or Alaric. Again, this happens a number of times. Actually thought he had been a licensed or paid general in the Roman army. He's a German now. All right, he is a Roman general being paid by Rome to defend the Roman Empire, and he rolls into Rome kind of like Julius Caesar did, across there and says, "I'm taking Imperium. I'm going to rule the West as an emperor." And they're like, "We got sacked by the Goths," and he's like, "Wait a minute, I'm a Roman. I get paid by Rome. I'm not a barbarian." You know, he probably even spoke some Latin, not to say very well, but he probably spoke some Latin. But because he wasn't a Roman, he wasn't Italian, they're like, "Oh no. This is not done by you people. We're the ones that run everything." So yeah, you had that. You have more than one general comes in there, and oftentimes, again, they probably think that they're Roman. They're probably paid by Rome, but again, you can see the breadth of culture at this point. Any other questions? That was a very good question. All right, thank you very much.
Thank you. And also, Father,